Hi, welcome to the Psyched Podcast.
No pun intended.
My name is Holly.
My name is Kylie.
Today we are going to be talking about this big debate called nature versus nurture. It's an age-old argument, a philosophical question that explores how much of a person's characteristics are the result of genetics, the nature side, and how much are a result of their environment, which is the nurture side of it.
A person's upbringing is the main structure that shapes their beliefs, behaviors, and even their mental and physical health. The environment they grow up around influences everything from their emotional regulation to their relationships and overall well-being, but can also make them strongly opinionated. The way a child's parent was raised imprints on how they raise their child, including picking up on unhealthy parenting habits or even victim complexes, which can and will significantly influence a child's behaviors and actions as they age, and is often why people are also different. It all depends on the parenting styles their parents or parental figures chose to use, and that affects how different or indifferent a person is from others.
We're here with Mr. Page, and he's going to tell us about his experience with psychology and how he got into it.
Hi, I'm Mr. Page. I actually have a psychology degree from Harding University in Searcy, Arkansas. It's a Christian university. Then I went on to get a master's in education later. So that's my background in psychology.
Which side are you on, nature or nurture, and why?
For me, it's a little bit of a combination of both nature and nurture. I know there's a debate between genetics versus environment, and I see a bit of both interplaying with people and how they grow up and their experiences, plus their kind of personality from their genetics.
And how did you figure out that's what you thought about nature versus nurture?
A little bit from observation. I did some classroom observations and watched different children of the same age group. Looked at some twin studies to see how twin studies where two twins were set up in two different states in America, and they grew up, but then they had similar likes of food, yet they completely didn't know each other since birth. And so I was like, there's got to be a little bit of genetics in play. And I thought that was pretty interesting. And then they had certain personality traits that were similar, so there's a little bit of genetics. Yet their environments were different. So I said, well, their personality can be environmental too, how they were growing up, who they knew, who they talked to. So I think there's a little bit of both.
And for the twins, is it 100% that they're definitely going to have a bunch of similar characteristics?
Yeah, in fact, that's the common thread with twins, identical twins. It's different with fraternal twins, but identical twins, they found many times that they have similar characteristics, like they like the same ice cream, yet they never knew each other until they were brought back together. So I was like, that was kind of a interesting thing to find out. Even taste, being similar to two people that grew up in two different states. Not always 100% of the time, but there, have been recorded instances in studying it. Yeah.
And how is it? How are paternal twins different from identical twins in like the psychology part of that?
Yeah, the genetics is different, about 50% of it. So it changes the environment versus, nature versus nurture. So the genes are a little bit different, so you wouldn't expect some of the same commonalities of identical twins.
And do you think finally learning that there's a difference between, mentally, that there's a difference between paternal twins and identical twins?
Yeah.
In terms of mental illness, do you think that's due more to genes or the environment of a kid?
So it's kind of an interesting question. There's a lot of studies saying, well, where does schizophrenia come from? Where does depression come from? Where does all that? And some people say, oh, it's all based on gene therapy and everything. But then sometimes with studying schizophrenia, they're saying, oh, this could be a product of the environment. Maybe they had some trauma in their past, and that's affected how they act around and being schizophrenic around other people. And it's kind of an interesting view into the environmental aspect of what happened in their life.
So do you agree with that? That schizophrenia isn't just part of genes?
Yeah, it seemed like there's more behavior in the environment than the genes itself. So, yeah, there's an interesting study on that, and that's what I found.
So, why do siblings have such contrasting personalities?
So even though they're from the same parents, they can have different personalities. You can look at, I have 3 brothers, and all of us have very different personalities. Some are super outgoing, some are more reserved, some are very talkative, some are like shy. So even though you come from the same parent, traits can be different in the same environment, even though they're doing the same activities, going to the same church, going to the same school, playing the same sports. Yet personalities can differ, and that could be part of the genes, is all the magic of what God's created us in a different way.
And is it true, or is it just a rumor that, like, if there's 2 siblings, do they both have completely different personalities, like opposing personalities? Like maybe one is introverted and the other is extroverted. Is that common, or is that like 100%, or is that just kind of uncommon?
Okay. So with people that are different, like I'll give an example with my family. I have a very extroverted brother. I'm more quiet when it comes to hanging out. He does more of the talking. Now that's just kind of personality, introvert versus extrovert. Not necessarily that all siblings are going to be very different. Sometimes they're very similar in certain ways. Like I have 2 older brothers, very similar, but they're very competitive. So yeah, it just depends on their environment.
At what age do you think a kid's mental health starts to affect them?
Well, that's another interesting question too, because they've done adoption, seeing like a child at the age of 2 and under usually adopts to a new family better than a child who's adopted over age 2. And their thinking is just a mental adjustment being in a new family. And it's easier to adopt when you don't have all the memories and the baggage from the last relationship with your parents. So there's usually around 2 years old, it's a pretty smooth transition. After that, there can be some hiccups, a little bit of behavior learned from the last family or the other different situation.
Do you think that a kid around 2 is easily more trusting than a kid, say, like 15 or 16?
Yeah,
like more gullible?
Yeah, life experiences kind of, and the trust factor can be changed by age. 2 years old, they're really looking at the parent for advice, how to, walk and step and eat and everything. While somebody older, their kind of life experience has shown them through their environment what they can and can't do, and they may or may not trust certain people, like older people or people of their own age. So it can vary by age for sure.
And do you think kids around 2 take advice from, or kids around younger, like toddlers or just like very young children, maybe in kindergarten, do you think they take advice from kids their age better than adults?
Yeah, there's something called peer-to-peer communication. And often, even though they could have a kindergarten teacher tell them to do something, they'll look to a peer and say, what are they saying? And then they'll give, it's called verbiage back and forth that's easier for each of them to understand. And it's kind of a neat reaction when a child to a child is able to communicate and be able to complete the task, like go stand over there, and the child looks to a friend and says, huh? And then the other one points, and then all of a sudden, boom, it's done.
And what do you think about a kid? How, in your life, how many examples have you seen of a kid, a younger kid, or just even like 15, like our age? Have you seen like trust a kid their age, even if they're wrong?
So that's interesting too, because a lot of times we were just talking about this in my class today. Going to peer for asking advice is very common at that age. Yet we talk about where is a good, way to get advice. Should you always talk to your peers for getting good advice on something important, or should you go to a parent or somebody in the church that gives a really good wisdom because they've already been to that place? So sometimes going to an older person gives a little bit better perspective and knowledge compared to a peer-to-peer in that age group.
Yeah, but sometimes I feel like if you go to an older person, sometimes they have more old time beliefs, so it doesn't really help you as much as you need to because of the time you're in now. So if you're going to, let's say, your grandma who's like late 60s, 70s, and she tells you how to deal with your situation, but it backfires because it's not exactly how you deal with the situation in this century.
Yeah,
What do you say about that?
There's definitely a disconnect sometimes with older generations, newer generations, younger, because there's different vernacular, different ways to handle different things. But sometimes the wisdom, if they can extract that from with a grandmother or a parent, sometimes it's helpful because they've been down that road already. So sometimes the wisdom would have to be kind of updated for current events, but sometimes it's there because they've already walked that road.
So, how does a person's upbringing really affect how they turn out and why?
So this would be the nurture aspect. So sometimes they can change how they grow up depending on their environment. It might be because it's a single parent. It could be just a average mom and dad situation, or growing up with their grandparents. So those affect the situation of the person growing up, the way they are interacting with peers, dropped out of school, who they go to advice for. Could be, oh, I want advice from mom, but mom's not there. So they go to their dad or their grandma. So there's definitely a different aspect of learning life's situations through those roles.
And in what ways would you say, like, if their parents were divorced, and the mom was saying, like, oh, like, your dad's a bad person, don't trust him. And the dad says, oh, your mom's a bad person, don't trust him. In what ways does that put a strain on the kids' like way of thinking and mental health?
Oh, very good, challenging question. Definitely that happens in divorce cases where they're using the children in the middle, back and forth as a pawn. Unfortunately, of course, God doesn't like divorce. It'd be easier if families were together. But in those situations, it'd be best not to use the child in the middle as a pawn, kind of pulling back and forth and use him to hurt the other spouse. But when that does happen, they have to rely on God, pray to them, and get strength from God to get through that. And the one parent will have to say, hey, look, they're just angry about the divorce. Don't let this affect you, and give that child encouragement.
And this may be a tricky question, but if the kid, like, let's say they were like 16, 15, kind of our age, if the kid had a choice between his mom and his dad who to live with, like, permanently, what do you think God's advice would be if the kid loved both their parents but didn't know who to choose?
Right, and that goes back to Moses when he gave certificates of divorce even though they weren't supposed to be divorcing because their hearts were hard. So if a child's trying to go with one parent or the other, it'd be good advice for that child to get advice from the church, from the elders, to say, here's what's going on, what's going to be best for me because I love both my parents. And then someone with an outside perspective can give advice saying, oh, well, I can see what's going on here, and let me give you some advice. If you live with your mom, these are the benefits. If you live with your dad, these are the benefits. Unfortunately, in life, we live in a sinful, fallen world, so those things happen, but we try to make the best of them.
One more thing. Do you think that if a kid sins, like, constantly, like, every day, do you think God makes them question themselves constantly as a result of those sins?
So for all, there's a scripture that says, for all have fallen short of the glory of God. So everybody sins probably every day. And what God wants us to do is try to better the next day. If a child is sinning all the time, it's not really God making them sin. It's basically saying, hey, these things are difficult. Satan's tempting them to sin. And if they fall, they're supposed to turn to God for strength. Instead of putting the onus on God, saying it's God's fault that I'm sinning, more turn to God for the strength.
Like taking responsibility and being able to apologize and pray to God for advice on how to be better.
Exactly. Good job. Yeah.
All right, so how are people's mental health disorders neglected because of misconceptions?
So sometimes mental disorders like depression or somebody who's just had a mental breakdown. It seems really absurd for someone who hasn't experienced that. Well, if you look at it, we're all creatures of God. We live in a sinful world, and sometimes sin gets to us or stress gets to people, and they just need a little help. So putting people into boxes in our mind saying, oh, that person's this way and that person's this way, is kind of a negative connotation to it. But if we know that, hey, they just need some help and encouragement to be less depressed, or they need to get encouraged from the church or prayers, so those things can help in those situations.
And what percentage would you say, like if a kid had very bad self-destructing tendencies, what percentage of that would be the parents' fault?
Well, there's an environmental question again for the nature, and it says in the scripture to bring up a child when they're young and they won't depart from it. So it's really important every day for every child to basically learn how to be what the Bible wants them to do and know and understand. That way they can flourish instead of having problems all the time. So yes, there is some responsibility of the parents. If they don't do any training at all for the gospel, then they might get more and more trouble with sin and issues like that.
So, how does a lack of essentials such as love or a parental figure or other things like that end up as a result of nature or nurture?
Okay, when you're looking at nature versus nurture, you're looking at traits, you're looking at genetics, but if they don't have the essentials, then you can look at Maslow's hierarchy of needs. And if their basic needs aren't being met, like food, clothing, shelter, then there could be a lot of issues that come up. And they could be stressed over the basic necessities and can't even think about going to school and learning something. So if they have those basic needs met, like shelter that's taking care of them and a place for food and love in a family, then they can go to like school or church and then have a good, healthy relationship in society. Without those things, it makes it very difficult, and that would be more with the nurturing part, how they're being taken care of from that standpoint.
And let's say lack of essentials like food in general, how does that, like if a person went like months without food because they couldn't afford it or just it wasn't given to them, they were starved, how does that affect, like does it cause like mental disorders and like distrust, or what does it create?
So that person would basically be looking and fighting for food more than anything else. And if they're doing that, they're not really concentrating on loving their neighbor or just having a relationship with God. They're down to the basic needs of fight or flight, and they could get into trouble trying to steal food instead of like having a regular environment where they could not worry about that as a child.
So fight or flight, how many teens have you seen like show you such vivid examples of it?
Personally, I've seen a few in my life where they've had issues. Even in kids going to college, they have had kids where they didn't sign up for a meal plan because they didn't have enough money, but the church was taking care of them. So it's sad when it happens, but of course, if you go to the church, they can help out in different difficult needs.
And at one point, if a person went so long without food, do you think they could possibly go feral, or even result to like really like aggressive tendencies?
Yeah, like I was saying, if they don't have the right environment, they might actually end up going to steal food because they're so hungry. I know in history they've had times when they brought up Spartan kids to learn how to steal food just to survive. So it goes back to Maslow, the hierarchy of needs, and saying you have to get food, and like I was saying, they could fall into sin and be stealing from a store just to satisfy those needs, and it's kind of sad.
All right, so how do nature and nurture work together?
Okay, so in nature, things are passed down from parent to child. So that's a learned, it could be like an example would be Christmas holiday. Certain traditions are passed down, joy of certain holiday and getting excited for that. While genes don't have those things. Those are learned, not in your genes or in your normal everyday traits in your DNA. DNA is more like your eye color, hair color and things like that. So some people say that, oh, well, you're going to be extroverted or introverted based on different traits in your genes. Well, if you have the environment to be like super outgoing, or you're trained to do that, that could be environmental more.
And how often is the addict gene passed down to a kid?
That's an interesting study too. They've done studies on rats and said, can this be passed down by a gene? And there's some studies that say, yeah, an alcoholic could be more influential in the second generation, but mostly it's basically based on the individuals being basically not or participating in alcoholism or not.
How does learning about psychology encourage teens to improve their mental health?
So with psychology, it's a time when people will ask, like a psychologist will ask a teen, what do you think about this? And then they give feedback. So there's a lot of introspection happening. Introspection is happening when they're looking at their attributes saying, oh, I'm struggling with this or that. Then they can communicate their feelings more effectively. I feel angry when my little brother takes my last cookie from the cookie jar. So there's a little bit of introspection, which will help the teenage grow and be more mature, going, oh, I haven't looked at it from that perspective before. And if they understand who they are and what they're feeling at different moments, then that can make them more successful in the future.
What advice would you give a teen who's trying to improve their conversational and talking about their feeling skills? What advice would you give them if they tried to, let's say, talk to their parent, a parental figure, about something that they did that hurt their feelings, but the only person trying to put effort into like the conversation is the kid? Like the parent is being immature and isn't validating their feelings. What advice would you give?
Okay, so parents are just people too. So sometimes we are not perfect. I'm a parent too. Sometimes I make mistakes. Yet if you approach a parent with something going on, using the I feel statements can help a lot. I feel frustrated when you tell me to go to bed, but you didn't ask me if my homework's not done. Or I feel frustrated when you said, I bet you haven't walked the dog, and you didn't say, did you walk the dog? So a lot of times using I feel breaks down the barrier of communication between a child and parent.
Okay, so what drives people to want to learn about psychology?
In psychology, there's a lot of students that sign up that I heard a professor, it was the department head, say, a lot of you in the class have signed up for psychology because you have problems you want to solve. So it was kind of, everyone kind of laughed like, oh, I bet you there are problems in the classroom. So a lot of people are trying to usually fix their own problems, or sometimes they're just more willing to help other people, and they have that nature of like, hey, who can I help with this information? So there's a little bit of both. There's a little bit of self-help and a little bit of wanting to help others. Depends on your motivation to get into psychology and help other people, or just learn, hey, how can I help myself?
Yeah, I know, because when I originally wanted to learn about psychology, my reason was because I already help so many other people. Why not just get paid for it?
That's funny. That's great. Yeah, sometimes people are already in that, like I'm saying, it's their nature to want to help other people, to ask them questions, to say, hey, how can I help you? So yeah, it's a natural tendency to want to get into psychology, to learn about people, how to help them, and how they can improve their lives using psychology. Now, obviously, psychology alone in a secular sense doesn't help a person 100%, but if you combine that with a godly perspective and showing the fruits of the Spirit to improve their lives and their spiritual well-being, that puts it at a top level.
And this might be a little inappropriate, but what would you say to people, like, let's say, like, my mom died, or, like, one of my friends' moms died, and I heard somebody say it's all part of God's plan while they were grieving. I personally feel like that's not the right thing to say at the moment while they're grieving, but what do you have to say about that?
Yeah, there's sometimes when someone's passed away, there's a time to listen more. Sometimes people say that just because in our culture, a lot of times it's said, or they'll say, I know what you're going through. And sometimes it can be offensive, like, well, they don't know what I'm going through. It's my emotions. So just listening a lot of the time will help. If people say that, it's just a little bit of a cultural thing, but people who lose people in their lives are going through denial and anger and depression and all these different emotions. So sometimes it's easier just to listen and say, hey, I'm going to pray for you. I know it's got to be a tough situation.
And what if a kid, say in like middle school or in elementary school, was like so strictly grown on like religious belief, like Christianity or something, that when they were being bullied, they thought it was because that they deserved it, that they sinned and God was punishing them. How do you think that like affects their mental health as they get older without anybody telling them that's not true?
Right. That's why it's important to talk to someone, a trusted adult, a parent, a pastor at church, to get feedback saying, this is what I'm thinking. I think I'm getting bullied because I've sinned or something like that. That way you can get good information. Obviously sins in the world, that happens, and, you can ask God for forgiveness. But if you got bullied by somebody, that could just be, sin in the world, and they're just trying to get under your skin a little bit. So it all in balance, talking to somebody like we were saying earlier, to saying, hey, I feel like I'm being bullied because of my sin. Is this a punishment? And getting that all sorted out so they don't feel guilty. It's just sins in the world, and they make mistakes, and it's usually not because of one certain thing.
And one last question. If a person was going through a lot and had sinned a lot to deal with like some of their personal problems, and they prayed to God for forgiveness, but they didn't feel forgiven and bad things kept happening to them, what advice would you give a person like that?
So often Satan uses that tool, that trick, to make people think, oh, you're not good enough, God can't forgive all sins. And it's a tool that we have to be aware of out there. Just know that any person that sinned it or sinned many times, that sin's put on the cross and forgiven forever. So we don't have to really worry about, are all of my sins forgiven? The answer is, of course, yes, because once you're a Christian, you don't have to worry about that anymore. Most of the time, it's Satan talking in our ear saying, you're not good enough, you sinned. But just kind of don't listen to that voice. That's just that negative talk.
Do the elderly get affected by mental health and depression as easily as teens do?
So in psychology, they have a field of study called geriatrics. It's the diseases of older people. Maybe not diseases, not a good adjective, but as you get older, there's another transition in life. Sometimes they get depressed just like we do at any age, yet they're more open to talk about death. They're more open to say their mind, and it has to do with an actual gene, like the prefrontal cortex has less of a filter. That's why often older people just say something like, wow, I can't believe they said that. And then you're like, oh, okay, well, there's an explanation with a physiological background, and that goes back to the nature versus nurture part of the actual physiology of older people. So yeah, they can be depressed, but more just open about talking about it.
And what if an elderly person was experiencing a bad, like a bad wave of depression, but like avoided everybody and didn't accept help from anybody? What would you do, like as a family member or as like just a person who cares about them? What would you do to help them?
Just talk to them, pray with them. A lot of older people feel like they're trying to be babied. They want their independence. And we don't want to overstep our bounds when they're super getting older compared to younger, because their whole life they've been independent, doing things on their own. And now they're feeling like, they're being controlled, and they're trying to take over their life. So have them feel like giving them choices. Here, we have a couple choices for you. What do you think is better? And then them being part of the decision-making process will help them feel less depressed and say, wait, I'm still, myself, and I'm in charge. And it makes a big difference over them being depressed, like, everyone's telling me what to do, and they want to be independent.
And have you experienced like a family member, like an older family member or a friend that was going through depression but didn't accept help? Have you experienced that?
Personally, I've seen it a couple times where they didn't want to accept help, and it's kind of sad because they kind of get locked into a box, and that's why it's so important to connect with other people, with their pastor, with their preacher, their elders at church, to get them to open up and say, hey, what's going on? And sometimes talking to an independent person like the preacher at school or a preacher at church or the elder at church, they can really get into the why are you closing down? What's going on? And then they can work through their problems and be more successful.
And help you figure out your own situation, like what do
Exactly.
you want to do,
Yeah.
help you figure out like where you want to go with this, if you want to get better,
Right.
and ways you want to get better in like a healthy environment.
Right. And one thing, people have to want to change. A lot of psychology pitfalls is that people come in and they don't want to change. So if the person is willing to change, they're open to that, that's usually when they're most successful.
All right, that's it. Thank you, Mr. Page. Thank you for your input and your time.
We appreciate that you stayed to talk to us about this. We really, really appreciate it. Thank you.
You're welcome. You guys did great.